Good morning. In the past few weeks we've been looking at the book of Ruth and the story of Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth going on a hazardous journey from Moab to Judah in the hope that Naomi's family would take them in and provide them some of the basic necessities of life, food and shelter and so on. But when they get back to Judah, instead of sitting around and waiting for the men to take over and do the planning, Naomi and Ruth get their heads together and take some initiative in looking ahead, planning for their future. The first positive thing that happens is Ruth gets a bit of work on behalf of both of them in a field, picking up grain that the reapers had not taken. It called gleaning. And it turns out that the field that Ruth gleaned in was owned by Naomi's kinsman, a man called Boaz. And Ruth returns to Naomi to tell her she's been gleaning in Boaz's field. And Naomi says, that man is a close relative, he's one of our kinsman redeemers. In fact, the whole story of Ruth and Naomi is dependent on the concept of kinsman redeemers. And what that means is that the nearest male relative in Judah of Naomi's deceased husband has responsibility to look after Naomi and her daughter-in-law, since she's also married into the family. And so Naomi develops her plan to bring Boaz and Ruth closer together. And all this is in spite of the fact that they lived in a very patriarchal society, and usually men made all the decisions about everything. I was listening to a video conversation recently about some events that took place in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. A lady called Kathleen tells how her husband, a civil servant, not involved in any way in the Troubles, one night the family were at home and the IRA burst in and took her husband away and left a gunman with them to see that they didn't go out and raise the alarm. They took her husband, chained him into the driving seat of a vehicle loaded with explosives, and forced him, probably with threats to kill the family if he didn't, to drive the vehicle to an army checkpoint, and then they triggered the explosive with a remote control device. Kathleen's husband and 5 British soldiers were killed. And of course, when Kathleen heard what had happened, she was absolutely devastated. But life had to go on, and she thought to herself, what am I going to do now after this has happened? Am I going to spend the rest of my life enraged and bitter and twisted because of this thing that's happened? So what she decided to do was to work for peace in Northern Ireland. For example, to stop the IRA or the Protestant paramilitaries doing revenge killings for her husband and the 5 British soldiers. So instead of taking the initiative for revenge, she takes the initiative for peace. The other participant in this conversation was a woman called Anne. As she grew up in her teenage years, she went to loads of IRA funerals, people who'd been killed in the Troubles, and she was brainwashed into hating the British and the Protestants. And all her family and neighbours hated the British and the Protestants. At 18, Anne joined the IRA and became a terrorist operative and was involved in all sorts of horrible and violent events, which she now bitterly regrets. Kathleen and Anne are now close friends. Over the last 20 years or more, they've talked together with groups and individuals about the futility of war of the need to do everything possible to prevent violence turning to war and try to resolve the issues in other ways. Now, today being Armistice Day, our thoughts turn to wars in the relatively recent past, in particular the First and Second World Wars, and we remember the many men and women who fought in these wars and died. In the First World War, Britain and their allies lost over 1 million dead. I mean, it's an incredible number, really. 1 million people killed. Then came the Second World War, the fight to prevent Hitler and fascism taking over. There's probably never been a time in human history where there has not been a war going on somewhere. If you look at the Bible, the killing starts with one of the sons of Adam and Eve. Cain slew his brother Abel, and it's been going on ever since. What war is about in most cases is power. Taking over somebody else's land and subjecting the inhabitants to their philosophy, religion, culture, way of life. And it may be that the hairy-chested male machismo has been the trigger that has, in human history, has created a lot of conflict and wars that could have been avoided by the intervention of thoughtful and peace-loving women. Women like Naomi, who took the initiative when she was the lowest of the low in social status, and in a patriarchal society, in theory, she was bereft of influence and power. But she decided not to leave her fate to the men, but take the initiative for herself and her daughter-in-law. Now, I'm not under any illusions about the ability of some women to be as bloody-minded and violent as men. I've witnessed outbreaks of violence in women's prison that almost made my hair stand on end. When I went there, I used to always sit with my back to the wall near the door, ready for a rapid exit should this be necessary. But these women, I think, were exceptional because of all sorts of factors, the main one being the violence and abuse they had suffered from men. There are other women in the Bible, notably one called Esther, who was a thoughtful and prayerful person and diverted a Holocaust from the Jewish people. Esther was the wife of one of the Persian kings during the 5th century BC, and she took her life in her hands when she went and appealed to the king to stop a plot which threatened to wipe out her people. And ever since the 5th century BC, Jewish people have celebrated the festival of Purim to remember how their ancestors narrowly escaped annihilation because of the bravery of Esther. There are a number of other prominent women in the Old Testament who are leaders and take the initiative, in spite of the fact that they lived in societies which were primarily patriarchal. For example, in the book of Judges, we read about Deborah. Deborah is the fourth, and as far as anybody seems to know, the only female judge. So in chapter 4 of the book of Judges, Deborah was leading Israel. She held courts in the country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided. It could well be that the world would be a better place if more women like Naomi, Esther, Anne, Kathleen, and others decided to try and take the initiative away from men in times of conflict. Today, being Armistice Day, we remember the appalling destruction and loss of life that took place in the First and Second world wars and many other wars as well. And it may be that in general terms, at least some women like Naomi and Kathleen, Anne, Esther and Deborah could and would bring a different perspective to conflict with a potential for war, and be more likely to seek a thoughtful and peaceful solution to whatever the problems may be. Amen.